The streets of Anchorage, Alaska are cold and unforgiving. It's the kind of place where people go missing, their names whispered briefly before being forgotten in the endless stretch of snow and silence. Among those trying to survive in the shadows of the city is Valerie Kassler, a homeless woman who has learned to navigate the dangers of the streets. She's always on the lookout for food, shelter, and anything she can trade for a few dollars. But on this particular day, she stumbles upon something far more valuable and far more terrifying. An abandoned pickup truck sits in a deserted parking lot, its windows coated in a thin layer of frost. Valerie approaches cautiously. It's not unusual to find vehicles left unattended in Anchorage, sometimes by drunks, sometimes by people who never come back. She tries the door, unlocked. Inside, the smell of stale cigarettes lingers. The seats are covered in discarded fast food wrappers, loose papers, an old jacket, and a few tools. She rummages through the mess, searching for anything worth taking. Then she spots it. A black phone half buried under some clothing in the passenger seat. Her heart jumps. A working phone could mean cash easy money at a pawn shop. But when she turns it on, it's locked, useless without a passcode. Annoyed, she keeps searching and finds something even stranger. An SD card. She holds it up to the light. There's a label on it, handwritten in black marker. The words send a chill down her spine. Homicide at Midtown Marriott. At first, she thinks it's a joke, some kind of twisted prank. But something about the way it's labeled, the almost casual handwriting, feels off. Curiosity wins. She slips the SD card into an old phone she's carrying. It takes a moment to load. Then the files appear. Images, videos, dozens of them. She clicks on the first one, and what she sees will haunt her forever. The footage is grainy, but it's enough. A woman tied up in a hotel room. She's struggling. Her breath comes in panicked gasps. The camera is shaky, moving as if it's being held by someone unbothered by her terror. Then comes the voice, deep, slow, amused. "You're not going to leave here alive." The woman sobs, shaking her head. She's saying something, but the audio is muffled, pleading. A shadow moves across the screen. The man holding the camera steps forward into view. His face is calm, almost bored, like this is nothing more than a routine. He speaks again, his accent unmistakable. South African. "I get the Oscar." Then laughter, cold, detached, like a director admiring his own twisted creation. What follows is beyond horror. The woman is beaten. The camera captures every moment, the cruelty in his hands, the pain in her eyes. She's choking on her own screams, but no one is there to help. Then, the final moment. Her body stops moving. The man leans closer, almost inspecting his work. He's not panicking, not rushing. This isn't a crime of impulse. It's something far worse. This is a performance. The video cuts out. Valerie drops the phone, her hands shaking. She stares at the SD card, her breath coming in shallow gasps. What the hell did she just watch? And more importantly, who is the man behind the camera? Valerie Kassler's hands tremble as she shoves the SD card back into her pocket. Her breath is uneven, her mind racing. What did she just witness? Was this real? Could it be staged? But the woman's terror in the video, the raw, desperate way she begged for her life, was too real. There was no faking that. And the man, the South African voice, the cold amusement, the way he treated the act of killing as entertainment was even more chilling. She knew she had two choices. She could drop the SD card and pretend she never saw it, or she could take it to the police. For a few agonizing moments, she hesitates. Who would believe her? She's homeless. She's stolen things before. The cops in Anchorage don't take people like her seriously. But the image of the woman's lifeless body won't leave her mind. She runs. The nearest police station isn't far, but every step feels like she's dragging the weight of something enormous behind her. When she bursts through the front doors, she's out of breath, wild-eyed, clutching the SD card in her fist. I need to talk to someone right now. The officers behind the desk barely glance at her at first. Another homeless woman, probably looking for a warm place to sit for a few hours. But when she pulls the SD card from her pocket and whispers the words, "It's a murder," they take notice. A detective is called in. Valerie is led into a small room, the walls yellowed, the chair uncomfortable. She can feel their doubt before she even starts speaking. She hands over the SD card. The detective slides it into a computer. A pause, then the files appear. The first image loads. The color drains from his face. He clicks on the video. The room is silent except for the muffled sound of sobbing begging. Then comes the voice, deep and slow. "You're not going to leave here alive." The detective stiffens. He clicks through more footage. The beating, the strangulation, the calm, eerie way the man laughs after the woman stops moving. The room feels colder. Within minutes, the entire station is on high alert. One officer mutters, "What the hell are we looking at?" Another rushes out to call homicide detectives. The hunt for the man in the video has just begun. Who is he? Who is the victim? And how the hell did this SD card end up on the streets of Anchorage? The video is played over and over again in a darkened police room. Detectives examine every detail: the walls of the hotel room, the furniture, the sound of a heater humming in the background. Every second holds a clue. But the most unsettling part, the man's face. He isn't masked. He isn't in the shadows. He looks directly into the camera. Calm, detached, like he's performing for an audience. His voice, laced with a South African accent, rolls through the speakers. "I get the Oscar." Then laughter, mocking, enjoying it. The detectives freeze the footage at the moment he steps into the frame. They enhance the image, zoom in on his features, the shape of his face, the lines around his mouth, the eyes that show no hesitation, no regret. One of them swears under his breath, "We've seen this guy before." They run the image through facial recognition databases. Within minutes, a name flashes on the screen. Brian Stephen Smith, a South African immigrant, no prior violent record, legally married, a truck driver. On paper, he's just another guy. But in this video, he's a monster. Now, they know his name, but does he know they're coming for him? On the surface, Brian Stephen Smith was the kind of man you wouldn't look at twice. A South African immigrant, legally settled in the US, married and working an honest job as a truck driver in Anchorage, Alaska. No criminal record, no history of violence. Nothing about him screamed killer. His wife, a quiet Alaskan woman, had been married to him for years. To her, he was just a reserved, methodical man who liked keeping to himself. No outbursts, no alarming behavior. A little odd, maybe, but not dangerous. His colleagues described him as soft-spoken, polite, never someone who lost his temper. If anything, Smith seemed a little dull and introverted man who kept his thoughts to himself. But inside his mind, a very different version of Brian Stephen Smith existed. Because the man in the videos, the one calmly torturing and killing a woman, wasn't an amateur. He wasn't panicked, wasn't impulsive. He was comfortable. He was performing. And that meant one terrifying thing. This wasn't his first time. Some killers leave a pattern behind years of escalating violence, warning signs, red flags. But Smith, there was nothing. No priors, no known history of abuse, no whisper of trouble. Which begged the question, how many times had he done this before? And how many times had he gotten away with it? For years, Brian Stephen Smith hid in plain sight, a man with a soft voice, a legal status, and a steady job. A man whose only mistake was losing track of an SD card, a single piece of plastic that unraveled his entire double life. Now, detectives knew his name, but they needed proof, and the video had given them their first lead, the location of the murder. In the grainy footage, the walls were a dull beige, the carpet an unremarkable brown. The furniture was plain, but one small detail in the background of the video stood out: the hotel's logo on a cheap plastic pen. Detectives zoomed in on the screen. Midtown Marriott. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Within hours, they were at the hotel's front desk, flashing badges and pulling security footage. It didn't take long to find him. September, late night. Security cameras captured Brian Stephen Smith at check-in. He wasn't alone. A woman stood beside him, his victim. She was alive when they entered. She was never seen leaving. The reservation was under Smith's real name. No attempt to use a fake ID, no effort to hide. He had done this so many times that he didn't even think about getting caught. The room he had stayed in had been cleaned weeks ago, fresh sheets, fresh carpet shampoo, every trace of what had happened scrubbed away. But the camera footage, it didn't lie. They watched as Smith and his victim entered the elevator together. 30 minutes later, Smith came back down alone. Calm, casual, like a man heading out for coffee. But inside that room, something unspeakable had happened. The woman who she was, how she got there, what she had been promised, none of it mattered anymore. She was gone, and Brian Stephen Smith had walked away like nothing had happened. But now he had left something behind. His face, his real name, his movements. Detectives finally had their smoking gun. Now it was time to hunt him down. The woman in the video had a name, but for weeks she had only been a face on a missing persons poster, lost in the chaos of Anchorage's transient population. Her name was Veronica Abouchuk. A native Alaskan woman, Veronica had struggled with homelessness for years. She drifted between shelters and the streets, often disappearing for days at a time. But this time had been different. She never came back. Her family had reported her missing months earlier. No leads, no last known location, just another name on a growing list of vanished women in Alaska. Until now. When detectives compared the footage from the SD card to missing person reports, the match was instant. Same features, same hair, same haunting expression as she looked into the camera the last time she was ever seen alive. The horror of the case deepened when authorities expanded their search beyond the hotel. If Veronica was dead, where was her body? The answer came days later. A search team, armed with GPS data pulled from Smith's truck, scoured the outskirts of Anchorage, the desolate, frozen wilderness where few ever ventured. And then they found her. Dump sites. That was the only way to describe it. Her body had been left in the Alaskan tundra like discarded trash, exposed to the elements, stripped of dignity. But here was the thing about Smith. He was calculating, methodical, a man who thought he had covered his tracks. He had never expected his own trophy, his own recording to lead police straight to her. Now there was no question. Smith had murdered Veronica, but how many others had suffered the same fate? And more importantly, how many bodies were still out there waiting to be found? Brian Stephen Smith had done everything right. He had picked a vulnerable victim, someone few people would come looking for. He had killed in a hotel room, not his home, making sure the crime scene could be erased. He had dumped the body far from civilization, trusting the Alaskan wilderness to destroy any evidence. But he had made one mistake. A mistake so careless, so unbelievably stupid that it had unraveled everything. He had recorded it, not just snippets, not just pieces, everything. And worse, he kept the evidence. The SD card, his personal trophy, the thing he should have destroyed, had been left in his truck. It wasn't hidden, it wasn't buried, it wasn't encrypted or locked away. It was just there, waiting to be found. And it had landed in the hands of the one person he never anticipated, a homeless woman looking for something to steal. Had that SD card never surfaced, had Valerie Kassler never turned it in, Brian Stephen Smith might still be hunting his next victim. That one oversight, that one careless moment of arrogance was what ended his reign of terror. Because for all his cold, calculated planning, he had left behind the very thing that would put him away forever. And now, the walls were closing in. Brian Stephen Smith had no idea the walls were closing in. For days, detectives had been watching his every move, tracking his routine, waiting for the right moment. They had his face from the video, they had his voice, they had his hotel records, his truck's GPS history, his victim's body. They had everything they needed. All they had to do was bring him in. Early in the morning, a team of officers moved in. They followed his truck, waiting for a spot with no escape routes. Smith was on his usual route, driving through Anchorage, maybe heading to a job, maybe running errands. He had no clue that unmarked police cars were following him. Then the takedown. Multiple squad cars cut him off at an intersection, red and blue lights flashing. Officers jumped out, guns drawn. Brian Stephen Smith, get out of the vehicle, hands where we can see them. For a split second, he did nothing. Then he opened the door slowly and stepped out. No fights, no arguments. His expression was unreadable. The man who had mocked his victims, who had laughed while strangling a woman on camera, now stood in the middle of the street silent, emotionless, almost expectant. Cops slammed him against the hood of his truck, cuffing his hands behind his back. "You know why we're here, Brian?" one of the detectives asked. For the first time, Smith spoke. "I suppose I do." It was almost like he had been waiting for this moment, like he knew this day would come. But even in handcuffs, he didn't seem afraid. Not yet, because Brian Stephen Smith still thought he could talk his way out of it. Inside the sterile walls of the Anchorage Police Department, Brian Stephen Smith sat alone. He wasn't sweating. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't acting like a man facing a murder charge. He just watched the detectives who walked in, studying them, taking in their body language like he was the one in control. Detective David Cordy sat across from him, sliding a folder onto the table. "Brian," he said, his tone almost casual, "we need to talk about the SD card." Smith didn't blink. "What SD card?" The detective opened the folder and pulled out a single printed screenshot, a still frame from the video. Brian Stephen Smith, his face, his voice, his crime. A long pause. Smith exhaled through his nose. He didn't deny it outright. Instead, he tilted his head like he was waiting to see how much they actually knew. The detective didn't give him a chance to spin a story. Instead, he reached across the table and pressed play. The video started. The grainy footage flickered on a laptop screen. The muffled sounds of a woman crying filled the interrogation room. Then came Smith's own voice, the words that sealed his fate. "You're not going to leave here alive." Smith stiffened. The detective fast forwarded the video, jumping to the moment where Smith stepped in front of the camera, smirking. And then the final nail in the coffin. "Everyone dies in my movies." Smith closed his eyes for a brief moment. That was it. His own words had just destroyed him. No way out now. The room was silent. For the first time, Brian Stephen Smith looked trapped. The man who had laughed at death, who had treated murder like a game, was finally the one with no escape. And the detectives, they weren't finished with him yet, because there was one chilling question still unanswered. "How many more are there, Brian?" For hours, Brian Stephen Smith sat in silence. No lawyer, no outbursts, no excuses, just long, empty pauses as if he was still weighing his options. Detectives watched him carefully. He wasn't scared. He wasn't fighting back either. He was just thinking. And then he finally spoke. "You have it all, don't you?" The lead detective leaned in. "We have enough." Smith let out a small exhale, almost like a smirk without smiling. "I suppose there's no point in lying then." A heavy pause. Then he started talking. It wasn't a breakdown. It wasn't a teary confession. It was methodical, detached, like he was walking them through the steps of a recipe. He told them how he met Veronica about Chuck, how she was alone, vulnerable, easy to lure, how she had been drinking, how he had made it seem like he was helping her. Then he described the hotel room, the moment she realized this wasn't a normal night, the fear in her eyes, the way she pleaded for her life, and how it had only made him enjoy it more. "It wasn't quick," Smith said flatly. "I took my time with her. No regret, no shame. Just facts, spoken as if he were talking about a job he had done." And then he said something that made the detective's blood run cold. She wasn't the first. The room went silent. The lead detective swallowed hard. "Who else, Brian?" Smith leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "You already know her name." The name Kathleen Henry had been in the system for months. She had been homeless like Veronica, a woman who slipped through the cracks, a missing person case that no one had connected to Smith until now. Smith didn't hesitate. He walked them through it like a man recalling an old memory he had no emotional connection to. "She was easy, trusting. She thought I was taking her somewhere safe." The detectives didn't say a word. "She fought a little," Smith continued, as if it were an afterthought. "But she wasn't strong enough." He had taken her into the woods, out where the city disappeared into endless miles of wilderness. No cameras, no lights, just the Alaskan cold. "She begged," Smith muttered, as if the memory was playing in his mind like a movie. "But they all do." And just like that, Kathleen Henry's case went from missing person to murder victim. Detectives looked at each other, the weight of the confession sinking in. One victim had been horrifying enough. Now they were staring at a serial killer. But one question still lingered. Was Kathleen Henry the last victim? Or were there more? Because the way Brian Stephen Smith spoke so casually, so calmly, it felt like he was holding something back. Like there were more bodies still waiting to be found. And that thought alone was terrifying. One confession wasn't enough. Neither was two. Brian Stephen Smith had killed at least 2 women. But detectives knew men like him didn't just start killing out of nowhere. If he had recorded one murder, how many more had he filmed? How many victims were out there, lost, nameless, buried in the Alaskan wilderness? They started by digging into his digital footprint. His phones, computers, cloud storage, South Dakota cards, every device he had ever used was combed through, and what they found only made the nightmare worse. More photos, more videos, more women. Some of them had names. Some were identified through missing persons reports. Others, they were complete mysteries. No reports, no known whereabouts. Just faces frozen in time in Smith's private collection of horror. Some were clearly still alive in the images. Others, it was impossible to tell. One detective stared at the files, his stomach turning. "How many do you think?" another officer asked. He didn't answer, because the truth was they didn't know. And worse, they might never know. Smith had confessed to 2 murders, but that didn't mean he had told the whole story. And the way he had spoken, the way he had recounted the details with such cold precision, so effortlessly, it felt like there were more. More women who had trusted him, more women who had never been found. The Alaskan wilderness was vast, merciless. How many of Brian Stephen Smith's victims were still out there, buried beneath the snow? While detectives dug through Smith's past, one question kept circling back. What about his wife? She had been married to him for years. She slept next to him. She shared a home with him. Did she really never suspect a thing? When authorities broke the news to her, she was devastated, shocked, horrified. "No," she insisted, voice shaking. He wouldn't do something like this." But then they showed her the videos. They played his voice. "You're not going to leave here alive." The color drained from her face. She covered her mouth as if physically trying to stop herself from screaming. She had no idea who her husband really was, or at least that's what she claimed. "I swear to you," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks, "I never knew." Detectives pressed her. Had he ever come home acting strange? Had he ever vanished for long periods of time? Had she ever suspected that the quiet, polite man she married was actually a sadistic killer? He did like to drive out to the woods alone, she admitted hesitantly. He said he just needed time to think. The room went silent. Time to think, or time to hunt. Detectives weren't sure if she was telling the truth or if she was hiding something. Had she really been so blind, or had she ignored the warning signs, convincing herself that her husband was just a little strange? One thing was certain. The monster she had been sleeping next to all these years. He had never really been hiding. He had just been waiting. Brian Stephen Smith knew he was cornered. The evidence was overwhelming. The SD card, the videos, the hotel surveillance footage, the GPS data from his truck, and worst of all, his own voice recorded mid-murder, gloating over his victims' suffering. And yet, he refused to go down without a fight. When he stood before the judge, he didn't break down. He didn't plead guilty. Instead, he smiled. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The courtroom fell silent. People exchanged stunned glances had they heard that correctly. The man whose face was on the SD card, whose voice was mocking his victims on tape, whose victims were buried exactly where his truck's GPS said they would be. He was saying he didn't do it. Smith's defense attorney wasted no time spinning a story. The SD card, planted. The GPS data, circumstantial. The voice in the video, manipulated audio. Someone, his lawyer argued, wanted Brian Stephen Smith to take the fall. "This man is being framed," the defense attorney told the jury. "He's a scapegoat in a city with a real crime problem. Ask yourselves, why would someone record their own crimes and then conveniently leave the evidence behind?" It was a bold move, but the prosecution was ready. Because there was one thing Smith couldn't argue against. The jury was about to see the truth for themselves. The courtroom darkened. A projector flickered on, and then the nightmare began. The jury watched as a woman begged for her life. They listened as Smith taunted her, telling her she was never leaving that room alive. They heard his laughter as he tightened his grip around her neck. They saw his face, his expression, the pleasure he took in it. There was no hesitation, no anger. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was something much worse. This was entertainment. One juror covered their mouth, unable to watch. Another turned away, eyes brimming with tears. Even seasoned detectives, people who had spent decades investigating violent crimes, looked shaken. Because Brian Stephen Smith wasn't just a killer. He was a predator, a sadist, a man who didn't just want to kill, he wanted his victims to suffer. The prosecution didn't hold back. "Look at this man," the lead prosecutor said, pointing directly at Smith. "He sat in that hotel room and tortured that woman. He strangled her while she begged him to stop, and he enjoyed it." Smith, he didn't even blink. He just watched the videos like a man watching an old home movie. No shame, no remorse, just cold, calculating silence. The jury had seen enough. No one believed his story anymore. Brian Stephen Smith wasn't framed. He was exactly what he looked like, a monster in plain sight. And now his performance was over. The verdict was swift. After weeks of testimony, chilling evidence, and the sickening footage played before a horrified courtroom, the jury returned with their decision. Guilty. On all counts. Brian Stephen Smith showed no reaction, no outburst, no plea for mercy. Just the same cold, emotionless stare he had worn from the beginning. The judge didn't mince words. "Mr. Smith," he said, his voice heavy with disgust, "you are a predator in the truest sense. You lured women, you tortured them, you documented their suffering like trophies, you took pleasure in their pain, and if not for one crucial mistake, you would still be out there hunting." Smith remained stone-faced as the sentence was read. Life in prison, no parole. It was the harshest sentence possible, and yet it didn't feel like enough, because nothing could undo the horrors he had committed. Nothing could erase the pain he had caused, and nothing could bring back the women whose lives he had stolen. For the families of Veronica Abouchuk and Kathleen Henry, the verdict brought some closure. But for detectives, one question still haunted them. Was Smith truly done confessing? Or were there still more victims, more names lost to the Alaskan wilderness, bodies waiting to be found? Because the way he had spoken, the way he had almost smiled when they asked if there were more, it felt like the full story hadn't been told, and maybe it never would be. If Valerie Kastler hadn't stolen that phone, Brian Stephen Smith would still be free. That one reckless moment digging through an abandoned truck, hoping to find something to sell, had unknowingly stopped a serial killer. But had she ever realized the weight of what she had done? Did she understand that by turning in that SD card, she had done what countless detectives, cameras, and forensic teams had failed to do? She had caught a killer, because Brian Stephen Smith was careful. He chose his victims wisely, women no one would come looking for. He left no evidence behind. And most importantly, he believed he was untouchable. He had gotten away with at least 2 murders, maybe more, and he would have kept going. But fate had other plans. One small mistake, one lost SD card, one woman who took a risk and turned it in. And that was all it took. The case had been cracked not by elite detectives or high-tech forensics, but by a homeless woman on the streets of Anchorage. If not for her, how many more bodies would have been found in the Alaskan wilderness? How many more women would have entered a hotel room, never to walk out again? And the most chilling question of all, was Smith truly the only predator like this still walking free? Or were there others just as careful, just as cruel, waiting for their next victim hidden in plain sight? The case was closed. Brian Stephen Smith was behind bars. But for the detectives who had spent months dissecting his life, something still didn't sit right. They had convicted him for 2 murders, but was that the whole truth? Or was it just the surface of something much darker? Investigators had seized multiple SD cards from Smith's truck, his home, his storage devices. Some contained videos of his known victims Veronica Abouchuk and Kathleen Henry, but others, they were different. Blurry, incomplete, unidentified women captured in fleeting moments. Some were smiling, others were asleep, unaware they were being recorded, and some looked just as terrified as Veronica had in her final moments. The problem, no one knew who they were. The images didn't match any missing person reports. The women, some of them never reported missing, some possibly still alive, others lost forever remained phantoms in a predator's collection. Had Smith toyed with these women but let them live? Had he hunted them, killed them, and hidden their bodies so well that no one even knew they were gone? Or had he simply not had the chance to finish what he started? Detectives kept searching, hoping to put names to the faces, to find more answers before the Alaskan wilderness erased them for good. But Smith, he wasn't talking. And maybe that was the most chilling part of all, because sometimes the dead can't speak for themselves, and the ones who know the truth, they take their secrets with them. Brian Stephen Smith thought he was untouchable. He recorded his crimes, believing no one would ever catch him. He laughed while he strangled his victims, convinced that no one would ever hear their screams. He collected trophies, videos, images, moments frozen in time because he wanted to relive their pain over and over again. And he almost got away with it. If Valerie Kassler had never looked inside that phone, if she had just kept it, pawned it, thrown it away, if she had never turned in that SD card, how many more women would have died? Because men like Brian Stephen Smith don't stop. They don't change. They just get better at hiding. And that raises one final terrifying question. How many others are out there killers who document their crimes, confident they'll never be found? How many SD cards, hard drives, secret files sit undiscovered, holding dark secrets the world hasn't yet seen? How many nameless victims are frozen in time, trapped in the memories of monsters who still walk free? And the most chilling thought of all, what if this was only the beginning? What if the next predator is still out there, watching, waiting, recording? And what if no one ever finds their SD card?